the orange one.
Yeah, we have the I have the ACG course.
Wait, is this for the advanced course then?
Yes.
Oh.
Supposed to be another one?
I'll be right back.
Well, my
Let me
brother's
just-
in the other class.
Oh,
so-
okay.
Oh.
Oh,
We got them sent in the mail and we had no.
Oh, okay.
Tell Rob I miss him.
Alright, I will.
I carpool with Sharia. I carpool with you, John, and Rob. To all study back in the day. Remember that?
Oh yeah.
That was a fun time. And Umber Cobb.
Yep.
Umber Cobb, that was a fun time.
I'll wait for him to get back.
I know, 'cause I'm like, wow, my family is huge. He was denied that he's embarrassed that I carpool with him though. It's pretty great. It was a fun time.
I think he's pretty proud. Aw, that's sweet. When's the new trick shot video coming out?
Oh, it already came out.
It already came out?
Hey, you didn't see it?
No.
Came out last night.
Oh shit. Shoot. My bad.
Okay, so just let me know if I write something on the board and you can't read it. I kind of said this the first time, I'm used to like writing on whiteboards, not really used to writing on a chalkboard. So if it gets a little messy, I apologize, or if you can't read it, just let me know and I'll explain it, or I can rewrite it. So today we are going to be working on reading. So kind of switching gears. In the last couple times we worked on English. So who can tell me how many questions are on the reading test? Just word it out.
40.
Exactly.
40.
questions.
35.
Good job.
Actually.
How much time do you get?
35.
35 minutes.
Jack, you've taken the test like 5 times.
So I probably should have started with this, but we're just going to go through kind of like a lot of the basics today, and then we'll also, if we have time, get into some of the strategies. So with the reading, we're going to try to like get all of the strategies and stuff out of the way first, so then once we start doing actual practice passages, you have all that information to start with. So it's not like you have half of the information, but there's some strategies that you learn after you start doing practice passages that could have helped you on those, if that makes sense. So it's going to be a little bit like strategy heavy to begin with, but then once we get past that, we'll focus a lot more on actual content. How many passages are there?
4.
You just gotta remember what you're reading.
Okay, I heard someone say 5. I will explain that because in one of the books it actually does
I just
say
go
that there
questions
are
and then
5.
go back.
The reason why they say that is because
If it like,
there's
shows
technically
what
4
line it's in,
passages, but
like,
one
if
of them
there's
is what they
questions,
call
then
a
go to
paired
the line
passage.
and
So it's like passage A and passage B, but it's all part of the same passage. So some books will say that there's 5 passages. The only reason why is because it's 3 normal ones, 1 paired passage. So I still refer to it as 4 just because like the paired passage is still going to fit under the same category. Like they'll be similar to each other, and you'll answer like a set of questions about both of them. It's not like it's 2 separate ones, if that makes sense. So how many questions are there per passage? You can do simple math.
10.
11?
10 questions per passage.
40.
40. Wait a minute.
Okay, and then if you divide it out, you technically have 8 minutes and 45 seconds to do each passage. But you want to try to do it in 8 if you can. So the reason why you want to try to get it done in 8 minutes is because at the end of the test, a lot of times you want that extra wiggle room in case you need to go back and look at some of the other questions. So a lot of times if you like star a question that you want to go back to, you want to double check the answer on, that gives you a little bit of extra wiggle room to do that. And then also if you wait to bubble in your answers, you also want some extra time to do that as well. Or that also accounts for if there was a passage that you found to be more difficult, then that gives you a little bit of extra time to spend on that one instead of trying to rush through it. So I'll wait a second. You are writing this stuff down. But you're fine. You don't have to.
I feel like we don't.
Mm.
Okay, so there are 4 different passage types, and they are always going to be in the exact same order. So that's one thing that you do know going into this test. So, one thing I forgot to mention, a lot of times with the reading test, people struggle with trying to get it done in time. So they basically, kind of like the opposite of the English test where they prey on you trying to like rush through it, and a lot of people get done early in that one. It's kind of like the opposite in the reading test. A lot of people do not get it done in time. And so a lot of the strategies that we're going to go through are ones that are going to help you shave off time, excuse me, so that you can get it done quicker. And then another thing with reading that makes it difficult is just that there's not, like, you don't really know what to expect. So there's going to be, we'll go through like the different types of questions, but since the like passages are always going to be about something different each time, it's harder to prepare for it. Whereas like in English and math, there are like, with English we have grammar rules that we can go through that you know that those are going to be ones that are always going to follow those specific rules. Or like in math, there's different formulas and equations that you can memorize to help you answer those questions. You don't have any of that in reading. It's just based off of how you understand the passage and if you can answer those questions in time. So we will go through some of that stuff on how to help you with that, but one of the best things with reading is just to do practice passages just so you get the hang of like going through the timing yourself and having a feel for what those questions are going to be like. So the 4 passages, they're always going to be in the same order. That's one thing that you know going into it. So within these sections, there's different types of things that you could find, but it's always going to fall under this same like general category. So prose fiction is kind of what it sounds like. It's a fiction, it's a story, it's a narrative. A lot of times it's the easiest one to read and comprehend just because for the most part that's what you're used to reading. And a lot of times it is going to use more laid back language, first person, things like that. So it's not as, it's more laid back than some of the other passages are. I should have asked this for the first one, but does anybody know what the second one is? Yeah, go for it.
Natural science.
Close.
No.
No.
Social science.
Social science. You got there. Okay. So,
And then 3 is humanities.
social science is your social studies, so it could be history, government, basically anything that has to do with social studies could fall under this category. Does anyone know what the third one is?
Humanities.
Humanities, there we go. So humanities is basically the arts. So it could be something about actual like visual arts, it could be something about music, could also be like photography or I'm blanking on what the word is. When you like build stuff? An architect. Architecture, there we go. I couldn't think of what that word was called. So those are also all things that you could find in humanities. And then the fourth and last one is that's basically what you think of with science. It could be chemistry, biology. A lot of times it'll be about like a specific animal, or I've read ones that are about like bugs. Again, the only thing with these is that while you do know like it's always going to fall in this general category, there are a lot of different types of subjects or different types of stories that you could end up reading within these. So it's just helpful to be prepared for all of them. So now our first strategy is to do these in your order of ease. So just because when you open up the test, this one's first and this one's last, you don't have to follow that order. You can skip around if you want to. And actually that's probably going to help you a lot. So, to try to figure out which order you want to do, I would think about which type of things you're interested in. If you haven't done a lot of practice passages and you don't know if there's a specific one that sticks out as being easier to you, then I would think about some of the things that you're involved in or some of the things that you're interested in. So for me, I did humanities, then natural science, then prose fiction, and then social science. Because for me, I was involved in choir in high school, and so I really liked reading about things that involved the arts, because that was something that was interesting to me and it was something that I liked reading about. I also really liked science, and then I absolutely hated social studies, and it never like clicked with me, so that's why I saved that one to do it last, because then by that time I would have a little bit of extra time at the end to spend more time on the one that I found to be most difficult. So the thought process here is that if you do the ones that you are interested in first, or the ones that you find easiest, you'll be able to get it done quicker, you'll be able to answer more questions correctly, so then when you get to like the last one, you'll have more time to spend on it, and then you'll be able to get those questions answered correctly. So if I would have done it in order, I would probably not have enough time to finish the last one, because I'd be stuck on the second one for a while and like waste a lot of time on that one, where I could have just skipped over to one that had easier questions. At least to me they were easier, because all the questions are worth the same amount, so it doesn't matter if you find it to be hard or easy, it's all worth the same amount. So try to get the ones that you find to be easiest done first, especially if you're going to be able to get those answered correctly. Are there any questions so far? Okay, one other thing I want to point out is that your order is something that you want to have picked out before you go to take the test. So it's not like you go and you open up to the reading test and you look at them and then you decide which one you think is going to be easiest. This is something that you want to have chosen before and that you want to practice with. So I would say at least a good 2 to 3 weeks before you take the test, you want to have this chosen and set in stone. So today, if you come up with an order that you think is going to work for you, and then you practice it and you find that you want to switch them around a little bit, that's totally okay. But just make sure that you have it done before you go to take the actual test. So like I said, there are different types of questions that you will find on here. And the reason why you want to know these is just because sometimes you'll find that there's a certain type of question that you find to be more difficult than the others. So then you can kind of focus in on that specific question or type of question and focus on how to fix those errors instead of just doing more and more practice passages where you're working on the ones that you continue to get correct. Okay, so the first one is going to be a main idea. It's the big picture, so it's just an overview of the passage. So an example of a question would just be, what is the main idea of this passage? Or it could be, what is the main idea of a specific paragraph? and you just have to be able to understand what the passage is about, and kind of like understand a general summary of it. So if you're confused about what the passage is about, like a main overview of it, a lot of times a good place to look is in the intro and the conclusion, because those are going to be ones where it's going to summarize kind of like the whole entire passage. And so kind of like look for a thesis statement in it, and it'll kind of give you like an introduction or wrap up what the passage is about as a whole, and that can give you a good idea for some of those questions. Okay, so then the next one is going to be detailed questions. So those are little picture questions where it's going to ask you something that is specific that you can find in the passage. So these are the easiest to answer correctly, just because the answer is going to be found somewhere in the passage, and it'll specifically like state it out for you. It'll exactly answer the question somewhere in the passage. You just have to be able to find where in the passage that it is. But the good thing about it is that if you do find it in the passage, you know that that answer is going to be correct. There's no questioning with that, because it tells you. Okay, so the next type is going to be vocab in context. And the reason why we add in context to it is because sometimes the definition of the word that you know is not necessarily going to be the definition of the word as it is used in the passage. So sometimes they'll just ask you for, like, what does this word mean? Or they'll ask you, like, which of these words could you replace with it? So they're basically asking for either a definition or a synonym of it. And then they'll give you those answer choices. And a lot of times they'll give different definitions of the same word, like common definitions that you might know. And so if you weren't looking back in the passage for that word to answer the question, you might just choose the one that like you know is a definition of the word, rather than checking it in the passage, because sometimes the meaning can change based off of where it is in the passage, or like how they're using it in the passage, if that makes sense. So I would say always go back and reread that sentence that it's in, and if you're still confused, maybe read that paragraph or like a couple sentences before, a couple sentences after. And then also with that, they'll always tell you what line it is. If they're referencing something in a question, it'll say in parentheses line 57. So you can go back and you can find it in line 57, so you don't have to search around for it. So it's not going to take a lot of extra time to go back and look for the context. Okay, so then there's also inference questions, which can be kind of difficult because those are things that are not specifically stated in the passage, but it's things that are going to be assumed based off of what is said in the passage. So they could sometimes say, like, based off of the passage, the author would most likely believe, and then they'll have different answer choices. So I would say pay attention to the words that they use in the passage, because a lot of times they will lead you to an answer. So even though it's not specifically stated, a lot of times they'll make it really obvious which side they're going with. So if it's like a conflicting viewpoint, they'll make it really obvious that they're going for this side rather than this side, or it'll show you kind of what they believe. You just have to pay attention to the wording that they are using. Okay, and then the last type of question is going to be the author's method or point of view. So this is where you have to think like the author. This ties into the inference, where they might ask you, like, what would the author believe? And then they'll give you a list of statements, and you have to choose the one, excuse me, that based off of what the author said in the passage, which of these would they support? So you have to have a good enough understanding of the passage to be able to answer these questions. And so, like I said, these last two are probably going to be the hardest to answer just because it's not going to be specifically stated somewhere in the passage. This is where you have to be able to understand the meaning of the passage beyond what is just said. So this is where it's important to do practice passages so you get practice with doing this. Are there any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so now we're going to go through different passage methods. And I'm going to give you 4 of them, and you can choose which one of these 4 you want to go to. And I want to preface this by saying that not all of these are going to work for you. You might have to tweak them a little bit. And there might be ones, the reason why I give you all 4 is because what works best for me might not work best for you. Because you might be a little bit faster of a reader than me, and so you spend less time on reading it, or maybe you need a little bit more time to read it than the person sitting next to you, so you spend a little bit more time reading it so you are able to understand it better. That's completely okay, and these are also just kind of like, these are where to start, so if you're not sure, I would start with one of these and then kind of modify it as you go, and they're all based off of trying to get it done in 8 minutes. But you don't have to completely stick to this. So if it says, oh, you should spend probably about 4 minutes on reading the passage, but you find that maybe you got it done in like 4 minutes and 30 seconds, I wouldn't stress too much about that, as long as you're sticking to the time close enough that you're not like going over by a bunch extra, if that makes sense. So the first one is to spend about 3 minutes skimming the passage, then spending 5 minutes reading and answering the questions. So if you are a fast reader, this one is probably going to be good for you. If you find that when you're taking the test, you get through the passages, you're able to read through them pretty quickly, and you still have a general understanding of what the passage is about, that's great. And if that works for you, then you might want to go with this one. And then that gives you a little bit of extra time to spend on answering the questions. Okay, so the next one is kind of splitting the time equally. So spending 4 minutes on the passage and reading it, 4 minutes on answering the questions. This is probably the most common way to do it, just split the time equally. If you're not sure which one to do, this is a good starting place, and then you can adjust it from there. So if you start doing this one and then you find that you're getting done quicker with the passages, then maybe you can spend a little bit more time on answering the questions. But again, if you don't know where to start, I would start with this one. Okay, so the third strategy, or method, I guess, would be to skim the passage first, and then, that doesn't make sense. Skim the questions first. Sorry, I was gonna say, I definitely wrote that wrong. Skim the questions first, and then go through, and while you're reading the passage, mark in there, some of like the things that you found in the questions. So the thought process behind that is that if you are able to mark in the passage, then when you go to answer the questions, you'll be able to go straight to those places that you marked and answer those questions right away. So essentially, by marking the passage, you're marking where those answers are going to be. The only tricky thing with this is that if you mark the wrong thing, then you could end up spending extra time searching for the answers to the questions. So if you are going to do this, make sure that you practice it a lot and make sure that you're not spending too much time on it. Yeah.
Are the questions in order of the passage? So like the inference questions will be last and then they'll be.
No,
Okay.
no, we'll go through that in a little bit, but they're not in any particular order, and then they also don't go in order necessarily with the passage. So like the first question could ask about something from the end of the passage, so it's not like the first paragraph is going to match up with the first question.
Okay.
So, good question though. That is something that we will end up going through, if not today, then the next time.
There's a clock.
Okay, so this last one, if you're going to do this, definitely make sure that you are careful that you're not spending too much time on this. If you had an unlimited amount of time, this probably would be the most foolproof way to read the questions first, then you read the passage. So then as you're reading the passage, you're able to like answer the questions in your head, and then you go back to those questions and you should be able to answer them right away. Again, kind of like with the last one, the only issue is that sometimes you might have like marked the wrong thing in the passage, or maybe there's like still questions that you aren't sure of the answer, and then you still have to go back and search for those somewhere in the passage. Now, I don't know if this pertains to any of you, and I don't need to know, but sometimes there are special circumstances where people get extra time on the ACT test. So sometimes people who are dyslexic, they get extra time on the test. So if you do get extra time on the test, then use it to your advantage, and then you might find that this one works best for you. But if you don't have the extra time, then you do want to, I would say, probably start with one of these two and go from there, just to make sure you're not spending too much time on it. And then one other thing I want to add, you never want to spend more than 10 minutes on one passage. So if you end up spending too much time on one passage, so let's say that you spend 10 minutes on the first 3 passages, then you only have 5 minutes left to do the last one, which is probably not going to be enough time, especially if you waited to do the one that you find to be the hardest for last. So then you're gonna run out of time on that one and not be able to get it done. So just be aware of how much time you're spending on each one. And if you find that you're getting close to that 10-minute mark, I would say just like move on to the next one, because those questions are probably difficult for you, and then you might be able to find some easier questions that you are able to answer quicker in a different passage. So a lot of the strategies that we've gone through so far are based off of timing and pacing yourself. I don't remember if I mentioned this with the English for pacing yourself. It is helpful to have some sort of watch with you. You cannot have any like devices that can connect like to your phone or the internet, but it is helpful to have a watch with you just so you can keep track of how much time you're spending on it. If not, then I would suggest when you get to your testing center to find where the clocks are in the room and just kind of like make a mental note of that, and then also make a mental note of what time you started it at, and then kind of like estimate around what time you're going to be done with it, so then you're able to kind of again pace yourself throughout by looking at the clock. So,
Do I still give you warnings?
any questions about that so far? Okay.
Until the party's okay, I'm sorry. Oh, cool.
Okay, so now we're going to go through some strategies and time-saving tips. So a lot of these are just going to be ones that are going to help you shave off like a couple seconds here and there, but especially in the reading test, every second counts. So don't be worried if you feel like you're running out of time, because you still, like, a lot of times it's totally okay, especially in the reading test, to be working up until like the very last second. Just make sure that if you are working up until the end, that you're still going to fill in answers for every single, like you're going to bubble in answers for every single question. So don't leave any blank.
Edelman was actually a good pick.
This one's just
It's really easy to fix. They're gonna make it the playoffs.
Okay, so I'm write the first two up here. These first two are going to be ones that you're going to read them and be like, well, this is pretty obvious. Like, of course this makes sense. But I will explain why I put them up here. Okay, so like I said, these first two are ones that you're going to see and you're going to be like, well, that's pretty obvious. Like, I know I should stay awake during the test. But the reason why I put these up here is because whenever I've taken the ACT, these are common mistakes that I've seen other people do, and ones that I've even like struggled to myself. So the first one is to stay focused, especially during the ACT. It can be really, really hard to stay focused on what you're reading, especially if you don't find it to be interesting at all. So just fake it, tell yourself in your head, oh my gosh, I love this, this is so interesting, I can't wait to read more about it, and just kind of like have that positive mentality with it, and you'll kind of like trick your brain into thinking that you enjoy it, and then you'll be able to stay focused better. And the reason why I put stay awake up there is because every single time that I have taken the ACT, especially during the reading test, I look over and like 15 minutes through the test, there's some other person kind of like sitting next to me who is, I don't know if they finished the test that early or if they just decided that they didn't want to do it, but they're just taking a nap. Which it can be, I mean, I'm not doubting them, but it's almost impossible to finish the reading test in 15 minutes. Just because there are a lot of questions that you have to get through, and unless there's some sort of genius and they have like a photographic memory or they knew all these passages beforehand, I don't think that they ended up scoring well on the reading test. So it can be hard to stay awake just because it's on a Saturday morning. Most of the time, you're not used to waking up that early on a Saturday. Most of the time, you're not used to having to think that much that early on a Saturday morning. And so just make sure that you are like staying awake, stay hydrated. If you need to, use caffeine. But I would also say that if you're not used to having caffeine in your system, I wouldn't just do it for the ACT, because that can also kind of mess you up and make you a little bit too jittery to the point where you're not focusing, you're getting a little too distracted. And then also, especially with the placement of the reading test, so your first two tests are English and math. They're your longest ones, especially by the end of the math test. Most people are kind of like mentally drained. The math questions get really, really hard towards the end. And so then by the time that you're finished with those two, at least for me, whenever I took the ACT, by that time, I was ready to go home and take a nap. Like, I did not want to be there anymore. And I'm guessing for most people, it's probably the same thing. Like, you just don't want to be there anymore. So during that 15-minute break in between, so after you take your first two tests, you'll have typically around a 15-minute break, and then you'll do your other two, starting with reading. So in that 15-minute break, make sure that you are taking that time to stay focused, eat a snack, drink some water, so that you are keeping your energy up, so that you are able to stay focused, and that you are going to be able to stay awake during these last two tests. Okay, so work at the pace that works for you. So if you see someone in front of you and you're still working on your first passage and they're like flipping through and they seem to be moving through it super quickly, don't get freaked out by that. Work at your own pace, work at the pace that you know is going to work for you. That being said, you still want to make sure that you're not spending too much time on one passage. The first time that I took the ACT, I went in not knowing anything at all. Like, I didn't take any classes, I had no idea how much time I had on each passage, so I had no idea what pacing was even about. And so then I saw other people in front of me, they were flipping through, and I was like, oh my gosh, they're going through this so much faster, I need to speed up. And then that freaked me out, I started rushing through it, and then I didn't score as well because I wasn't working at a pace that worked for me. I was trying to base it off of someone else's pace, and I ended up rushing through it. So just don't, I would say, just don't pay attention to other people. Just focus on your own test. You don't need to worry about the other people that are around you. Just do what is going to work for you.
That's a big hit for blocking.
In the playoffs.
But Tom Brady's been playing great this season. And our defense is playing quite well.
Okay, just let me know if you can't read that and I need to rewrite it up there. But this next one is, don't try to find the easy questions first, because the questions do not necessarily go in order from the most difficult to the least difficult, or vice versa. They're not going to go in order from, they're not gonna start with the easiest ones and then end with the hardest ones. They're gonna be all mixed up. And you'll actually, in some of your practice books, they'll actually tell you when you go to look at the answers, it'll tell you how difficult the question was. It'll say, oh, this was an easy question, this was a middle question, or this was a hard question. So you can actually see based off of those that there's no pattern with it. It's all mixed together. One of the things that I've seen before is on social media, sometimes before like the PSAT or the ACT, there'll be certain things that kind of go around and they're like, oh my gosh, this is how I raised my score. And one of the things on there was that they said they either put, I don't remember what it was, they said that they either put the easiest questions first, so then by the time you get to the end, you don't have enough time to do the hard questions, or that they put the hardest questions first, so then you waste more time on that, and then they put the easiest questions last, so then you don't have enough time to get to those. That's not necessarily going to be the case. They're all going to be mixed together. Like there's not going to be, like, it's not like the first passage is going to have the easiest questions and the last passage is going to have the hardest ones. No, they're all going to have easy questions, they're all going to have hard questions, and they're not going to be in any particular order within like the set of questions. So that's something to be aware of. Don't always pay attention, or don't always listen to everything that you see online, especially with those tips. Some of them are valid, but some of them are also going to be ones that aren't necessarily correct.
English passage.
Okay, so this is kind of similar, and I also kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. You don't want to answer the questions as you go along because they're not necessarily going to go in order with the passage. So, what I mean by that is that the first question could ask you something about the beginning of the passage, it could ask you something about the middle of the passage, or it could ask you something about the end of the passage. So, it's not necessarily going to line up perfectly where you could read the first half of the passage and then answer the first half of the questions. There is sort of an exception to that rule with the paired passages. I don't have my book with me, but if you look at paired passages, it'll say questions 1 through 4 are about passage A. Questions 5 through 8 are about passage B, and then questions 9 through 10 are about both passages. So those are going to sort of go in order just because you could read passage A first, answer the questions specifically about passage A, then read passage B, answer the questions about passage B, then answer the questions about both of them together. That is going to be the only exception to that rule. Or you could also just read both of those paired passages and then answer all the questions together. Either way is going to be fine. Either way will work. But. Okay, so another thing that helps is to think of the style that the passage is written in. So what I mean by that is that there's going to be different language used in different passages. So prose fiction is going to be more laid back, a lot more of terms that you're used to, whereas natural science is probably going to have, it's going to be a lot more serious, it's going to be more formal. And probably use some scientific terms that you may or may not be used to seeing all the time. So just be aware that there's going to be a difference in the style that it's written in and the language that is used between those different passages. going to seem a little bit weird, but like I said at the beginning, some of these can shave off a couple seconds at a time, which will in turn end up saving you maybe like 30 seconds to a minute on a whole passage, which you could end up using later on a question that you find more difficult, or maybe spend more time on a certain passage. So we have a tendency to like sound out things in our head as we're reading it, like as if we were going to be saying it out loud. But the thing with this is that you're not going to ever have to say it out loud, so you don't really need to know how to be able to pronounce it. So if you've come across a word that you don't know how to say, don't spend that extra time like trying to figure out how to say it. If you need to, just like cross it off and give it like a shorter name or give it a letter, and then every single time that you see that, do the same thing. So then it can only, it might only save you like 2 to 3 seconds, but if that word comes up 10 times within the passage, that's 30 seconds that you've saved that you could end up spending on, like I said, and that could end up helping you answer, or like that extra time could help you to make sure that you actually end up finishing all the questions on the test. So, seems kind of weird, but it is something that is useful. Okay, so all of the answers to the questions are going to be found somewhere in the passage. So don't be afraid to look back and try to find that answer. I know a lot of times people aren't used to being able to look back into the book because for school, you have to be able to remember it. In this case, you don't. So if you have a question and you don't know what the answer is, go back and look for it and double check that that answer is going to be correct.
What does ACT stand for?
American College.
Okay, and then another
American
thing that
College
helps to
Test.
save a little bit of time is to bubble in your answers after you finish each passage. So you don't have to bubble in the answers after you answer each question. You can wait until you're done with the passage, then bubble them in all at the same time. When you're bubbling in answers, if you're going from like the question to your answer booklet, a lot of times you're losing your focus. Whereas instead of doing that, you can just go through all those questions. Your focus is staying on those particular questions, that passage. Then once you finish that, okay, bubble in all the answers for that passage and move on to the next one. So the proctor is basically just the person that's giving you the test. The reason why I say that is because another time when I did this, I had people ask me what a proctor is. So when they announce that you have 5 minutes left in your reading test, stay calm, don't start freaking out and panicking, because 5 minutes is a lot of time, especially in the reading test, to get stuff done. So if you still have one more passage left, while 5 minutes is not ideal, you can still get through a good amount of the passage and answer a lot of those questions, and like make sure those answers are correct. But then also just make sure that you're not going to run out of time. So make sure that you are staying aware that, okay, they announced that there's 5 minutes left, there's probably like 2 minutes left now. I still have 5 more questions that I haven't answered. I might want to bubble those in and make sure all my other answers are bubbled in so that every single question is answered rather than like running out of time. sure that every single answer is bubbled in before you run out of time. Are there any questions about anything that I have gone through today